Good evening and welcome to the Discovery Building. I'm Brian Mattmiller. I'm Chief Communications Officer for the Mortgage Institute for Research. And Mortgage is one of three partners in the Crossroads of Ideas series. We also are partners in the building, are part of this event, including the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation and the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery. And kind of our goal of Crossroads of Ideas is to kind of bring about the vision of the Discovery Building to kind of serve as a hub of collaboration for all sorts of disciplines and ideas across not only the campus but the community. So Crossroads, we like to highlight issues that are kind of current, in the news, important to people, but also intersect with some of the great expertise we have here on our university faculty. The format for tonight's talk is we'd like to have an initial 35 to 40 minutes of the presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A afterward. We are recording the event, so if you do have a question, if you could wait for one of our volunteers to bring a mic to you, and we'll get your question recorded on audio as well. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, J. Michael Collins. And Michael is faculty director of the Center for Financial Security at UW-Madison, and he is the Fetzer Family Chair in Consumer and Personal Finance in the School of Human Ecology, an associate professor at the La Follette Institute, and a family economics specialist for UW Extension. He also serves as an affiliate on the Institute for Research on Poverty and the Center for Demography and Ecology. And Michael studies consumer decision-making in the financial marketplace, including how public policy can influence things like credit, savings, and investment choices. With colleagues, he's done research recently on financial coaching and education, and is currently looking at studying the correlations between financial management and health. He's also author of the 2015 book, A Fragile Balance, Emergency Savings and Liquid Resources for Low-Income Consumers. Please welcome Michael Collins.
Well, thanks everybody for coming tonight. I really appreciate your interest in this topic. This is a broad topic, so I'll sort of apologize in advance. I'm going to kind of do the 100,000 feet in the atmosphere, sort of fly over a lot of different research topics. But really, my goal here is to give you a broad sense of how we're thinking about financial well-being and how it might differ from how you might think about financial issues. I mean, oftentimes people think about financial issues as dollars and cents. And so partly I'm here to argue it's about a lot more than that and sort of how we think about those kinds of issues. So just a quick commercial on the center. You heard a little bit about it earlier, but we're a campus-wide center. We have people from different disciplines who are interested in household finance issues. And so they could be interested in certain business side, sort of financial products. They might be more interested in social programs and how people how people's engagement with social programs affects their behavior. And then we do a lot of work with policymakers. On Monday and Tuesday of next week, we're hosting an event with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Department of Treasury, and a number of other agencies around financial coaching for two days at the Fluno Center. So part of what we do is really focusing on this engagement with policymakers around issues in consumer finance. All right, so here's a quick audience engagement question. So as you think about yourself, what would make you feel most financially secure? I'll read them once and I'll go through and try to do a show of hands. So A is knowing more about personal finance. B is not worrying as much about managing money. C is having access to better financial products and services. D is having a lot more money. And E is something else. So how many people say A? Couple. B. C. Couple. D. Or E. Something else. So I think the most important thing to notice about that is that almost everybody answered at least one of those, right? And we had a pretty broad distribution. A lot of people said having a lot more money, but there was still a distribution. And I think the biggest thing we can take away from this is that it really depends. It depends upon your situation, your life context. What's good for you might be to save more. What's good for me might be to borrow more. We really have to think about each person's financial goals and where they're at, and really what might be the best thing for them there. The last few years has been a real effort to try to measure financial well-being. And to do that, we have to have a measurement tool, some kind of survey question. And so through the process of about 80 different interviews with people across the country, this definition was brought forward, and this was reported out in a research report or a brief that came out from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau about 2 years ago, where they define financial well-being as a state of being where a person can fully meet current and ongoing financial obligations, can feel secure in their financial future, and are able to make decisions that allow enjoyment of life. What's interesting is through these 80 or more qualitative interviews with real people, talking about their real day-to-day finances, not that many said, I want to be a millionaire. Not that many said, I just need all my debt to go away. I just need somebody to give me a piece of land. They just said, I want to be secure. I just not have to worry. I want to have control. I want to be able to do the things that I want to do. And that seemed to be the overwhelming theme that came out. And so 4 main themes that came from this research were people talked a lot about having control, day-to-day, month-to-month control. The bills are due at the end of the month. I want to be able to not have to scramble to make ends meet and to be able to feel like I have some control over my financial life. Having the capacity to handle a shock when it happens. This came up a lot. Shock could be everything from car broke down to I forgot that I have to pay these school fees to a refrigerator, appliance, roof, all those kinds of things. Or it could be something like losing a job where I don't have the income. What's really important to people is that they're on track to meet their goals, whatever their goals might be. And so your goals, like I said, your goals might be to save. My goal might be to borrow. We have different goals, but whatever it is, we each want to feel like we're making progress towards the thing that is important to us. And then it's finally the idea of financial freedom, of not having to feel like we're making decisions constrained by our financial resources. So it's very subjective. What we end up with is very subjective. People feel better off. We have since done a lot of work trying to measure using a scale what people's financial well-being is. And it turns out there are people who have relatively high incomes, 6-figure incomes and quite a lot of wealth, who feel financially insecure. Could be a lot of reasons for that, but they just don't feel like they can make ends meet. They're struggling to get by. They're struggling to keep up with their bills. They're struggling to keep up with the kinds of things that they think they should be doing or want to be doing. And then we also find people with very low incomes, almost very little assets, very little debt, very little engagement with the financial market, who feel pretty good. They actually feel like they have some independence. They have the ability to deal with a shock if it comes along. They have some stability, some control. So you can find examples on both ends of the economic spectrum of people who feel like they're more or less financially secure. Now, obviously, it's really hard to feel financially secure or to have a sense of financial well-being if you have no income and your landlord's beating on your door for rent and you don't have enough food. Those kinds of things those sort of economic context really strains people a lot. But it's not just about money, and that's the main takeaway we have. And we see people with a high income or high wealth and still reported relatively low financial well-being. And so you can think about this as, we obviously have the social and economic context. Let's see if my pointer works. So social, economic, these are the major things, having housing, basic food, basic self-sufficiency. Then there's some personality and attitudes. Some people, you probably know some of these people, are just not going to be happy, right? Or they're not going to be as happy. They're going to worry. They're going to sort of feel like they always need to be better. So some of this is personality and attitudes. But then there's this, and then there's sort of the decision context. Like, am I making a choice in the heat of the moment? Am I sort of taking my time, make these decisions? But then there's these 3, main factors. You can think about these as levers that maybe we can individually or collectively have some influence over. How much we know, what we're able to do, the kinds of skills and capabilities we have, and the kinds of products and services that we have. And so today I'm really going to talk about these 3 levers you can think about as affecting people's behavior and then ultimately their financial well-being. And that's sort of the model that I'm going to go forward on. So you can think about these 3 levers or 3 legs. I'm mixing metaphors here, I apologize. So 3 legs of the stool of financial well-being. So we have financial literacy, which is about knowledge, financial capability, which is about skills, confidence, the ability to do stuff, And then financial inclusion is sort of the term of the art, which means you can get access to loans, to savings products, to those kinds of different tools to use. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn, and then open this up for your questions in our discussion. All right, so we have this term financial literacy. It's a term I don't love, to be honest, because financial literacy is not like reading literacy. Reading literacy is understanding the construction of words in a given language. We usually don't change the alphabet halfway through people's lives. We do in finance, right? If you took a financial literacy class in the 1960s, you didn't learn about adjustable rate mortgages or about 401k savings plans, right? These things didn't exist. We don't do that to you as much in the English language. We don't just introduce a new letter and then hope that everybody catches up. So it's a little bit different. But when we talk about financial literacy, it really has different dimensions. In the state of Wisconsin now, more and more schools are actually teaching financial literacy starting at young ages, oftentimes in high school. Most of us in this room probably didn't take financial literacy or financial education when we were in school, but it is sort of becoming more and more common. We're teaching it more on this campus as well. But part of it is just knowing terms. What does interest mean? Knowing what different kinds of accounts are. It's just really definitional. It's relatively simple. Some of it's more applied numeracy. And this is what oftentimes shakes people up, because we have to deal with percentages, and we have to multiply percentages by numbers, and then even worse, we have to multiply percentages by numbers and then show growth rates over time. We have to compound the interest. That's like, this is really, really a tough math for a lot of people to get through. And that's where a lot of people shut down, frankly. When we do financial education and we start to get into percentages and we start to get into percentages multiplied by percentages and exponents, we've lost a big share of a lot of audiences. And so it is a sort of applied numeracy, but there's a real art to this in helping people feel comfortable with the numbers behind some of those financial literacy things. I think more important, frankly, in financial literacy is this idea of rules of thumb. Simple things like there's no free lunch. If somebody offers you a great return on investment, there's a price to be paid for that somewhere. Maybe it's more risk, maybe it's some high fees. There's something there. So you should learn this concept of no free lunch. The idea of costs and benefits, that you have to weigh the pros and the cons, the costs and the benefits. The ideas of opportunity cost, that when you do something, you can't do something else. Sort of basic concepts we can help people understand. The idea of a margin, of the next thing, that one more thing, and what does that cost. And then really what financial literacy isn't so much is getting people to become experts on all things in finance. It's getting them to be able to say, I don't think I understand what you're saying, right? To be able to call out some financial provider or somebody else to say, I would like you to explain that to me one more time because I don't think that made sense. And so it's getting people to be a little more confident in their ability to ask questions and to try to push a little bit further and not just assume that what they're being told is true. It's really not high-level math. It's not rocket science. And so a lot of what we try to think about is how to make this as simple as we can. The other thing that's important about the financial literacy side we've learned is that it's not one size fits all. I can't tell you what the curriculum should be. I can't tell you what the learning objectives should be. It totally depends upon that individual and their decision-making context. Teaching 15 and 16-year-olds about mortgages makes some sense, but they're probably not going to apply for a mortgage until they're 30, at best, 35. So it's 15 years before they need that information. How much information do you really think they're going to retain over that 15-year period? So we see those kinds of things frequently where we sort of provide too much information at the wrong time for where people are at. So we really have to match the content to where people are in the life course. Oftentimes people really just need a little bit of information, just enough to understand what they're getting to. We see this with mortgages. I used to do a lot of work studying mortgages. Do people need to understand every little nuance of the mortgage and how the amortization schedule works and all these kinds of things? Probably not. They need to know, what's the interest rate? Does it change? How often does it change? How much will I be paying in interest versus principal? What happens if I prepay this early? Do I pay any kind of fine? I mean, it's really simple kinds of information that they need. I think one of the things we're learning is that we can deliver this kind of information really flexibly. I used to work in consulting for some federal agencies that were doing mortgages for low-income populations, and our rule was that every borrower had to go through 8 hours of home buyer education. That was a very ambitious goal, and a lot of good borrowers said, I'll just not take the loan. Thank you very much. I don't want to sit down on a Saturday and spend 8 hours in the class. It was too much. And so now a lot of this information is provided on online courses, mobile phones, different kinds of, let's quiz you and figure out what you don't know and then just teach you what you're deficient in, as opposed to assuming everybody needs the same 8-hour block of education. I think we do, though, have to be careful, because we have to assume that people have some level of basic knowledge, some basic math, some ability to do things like spreadsheets and those kinds of things. And so, we do have to be careful, because there are a good portion, I don't know the exact number, of the general population who really aren't comfortable with things like percentages. And that can slow you down if you're trying to do really basic and quick financial education. So here's some examples of some financial education experiments that we've been involved with. This was actually in Wisconsin, of employees at about 60 different credit unions. So these were both line staff, tellers, and backroom staff at credit unions around the state. About 3,000 of them were involved in this experiment, where half of them got the financial education and half of them didn't. And we saw them increase how much they put into the retirement accounts. And essentially what they were doing is realizing that they weren't maximizing what their employer match was, and they were putting up a little bit more, about $30 a month, to be able to reach their employer match. We estimate that over a 10-year period, each of these individuals would have another $3,000 in their much more than that, actually, I forget now the number, $3,000 to $5,000 in their retirement accounts, because of a very simple intervention that they did online at the workplace. So that's one example where we saw an impact on people's behavior from a little bit of information. Here's an example of 3 states that implemented a financial literacy education curriculum in high school. So as a graduation requirement, Georgia, Idaho, and Texas in 2007 said everybody who graduates from 2007 and forward has to go through this. Before that, they didn't. So this gave us this nice little quasi-experiment. We could compare these students to people in nearby states, or to other states, other students that look like them, and see how they change. And we see that in this case, their credit scores were improved, and we saw that their rate of missing payments, and that's what we see on this. This is the change in credit scores, but what the driver of it was that they missed payments less often. So they basically were not late on bills, especially 30 days late, 60 days late. They just weren't missing their payments as much. They understood the impact of paying bills on time. This is through the age of 22, and so we saw them sort of better off relative to their peers. Here's an example of an education program for low-income women in a housing program in Long Island, where they were provided a voucher to find low-cost subsidized housing. We did a financial literacy intervention with them, and originally we expected to maybe see them save more, or engage in maybe paying their bills more on time. We didn't see any of that. We saw them borrowing more, and we thought, oh, this is bad. We've poisoned them. We've encouraged these people to borrow more. And then we met with the social workers, and they were like, no, these are women who had no access to credit. No one would give them a loan. They went through this education, and they were able to borrow for things like a car. When you live on Long Island, if you don't have a car, you can't get a job. You can't get your kids to their after-school activities. You can't do these things. We don't have public transportation. And lo and behold, it was a lot of women who figured out how to get their financial paperwork and other things in order to be able to take out a relatively small loan to be able to buy a used car. So in that case, this is a good example of what I talked about earlier. It's hard to know what the right outcome is for any given population. So like I said before, I think we're focused more and more now on this idea of simple. So here's you can think about this as a curriculum. What are the financial literacy things that people need to know about setting goals, letting goals drive your behavior, not the salesman who's trying to pitch some product to you. Maintaining an emergency fund, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Automating your bills and saving, sort of pay yourself first, and don't, if you leave it up to you to pay your bills with whatever is left at the end of the month, you'll oftentimes find yourself in a bind. Using systems, if you have multiple accounts, trying to manage using mobile phones or other kinds of devices to try to keep up with things. Maximizing saving matches at work. Pay attention to due dates. One of the biggest reasons that people miss their bills isn't because they don't have enough money, it's because they've missed. They just weren't paying attention. So attention is it's a very valuable commodity, and nobody likes to do bill paying. It's not part of, oh yay, today's bill paying day. We just finished our taxes. I don't think most of us are like, yay, I just got my taxes were really fun this year. So people avoid these kinds of things. Understanding insurance and how to use insurance. Paying off credit cards and watching out for fees and costs. So we could probably do a 45-minute financial education curriculum and cover all this, or we could cover any one of these in probably 10 minutes. And that's all oftentimes a lot of audiences need. And so it's really getting down to the basics of what people need. So I'm just using this as an example, not that everyone should use this, but we can boil these things down and make them pretty easy with nice little pictures like here too. All right, so let me get on to the second leg when we talk about financial capability. So this is skills and confidence. This is taking that knowledge and putting it to use, actually doing something. So it's confidence. It's the ability to adapt as things change, as new products come online, or you get married, or you lose a spouse, or you have a child, or other kinds of things. It's about self-control. One of the biggest things we find when people feel like they have financial confidence is that they are able to follow through on their goals. They don't procrastinate. They don't, they think they should save, but they can't help themselves from spending on something. This attention, I'm more and more convinced, oftentimes when we do an intervention, all we're really doing is saying to people, hey, pay attention to this. It's not necessarily that you know anymore, it's just that you pay more attention to what you're doing, or less inattention. There's lots of work that people in behavioral economics and other fields are doing to highlight this issue of attention or salience. And then this goal-driven behavior. When people have goals and let the goals drive their behavior, they're much more likely to follow through and get the things done that they need to do. This is some of you know this, the Whole House in Chicago. This is the settlement house movement from 100 years ago now. And what's interesting is that when the settlement movement began in the cities and trying to help people who were resettled into cities from rural areas, as well as immigrants who were coming in from new countries, their whole model was around financial capability. How do we help you to become more financially self-sufficient? How do we help you able to navigate this urban financial system and economic system that you're in? And in some ways, we're coming right back to that again, this sort of holistic idea that we're going to help you build some skills so that you can then do things on your own, to become empowered and to handle some of these issues on your own. So a lot of what financial capability is about is helping people set goals. If you do surveys of the general public and almost at most age ranges, only about 3/4 of people can even say they have a financial goal. And then a fraction of them can actually articulate what that financial goal is. And so, it's getting people to go through this sort of discovery of what's important to them and what their goals are, and then set up some action steps is really important. And I think oftentimes what we've done, unfortunately, in the financial literacy or financial counseling is to treat people like they're somehow deficient. You're broken, you messed up, you're bankrupt, you're, even the terms and words we use for people who are broke. You're broken, you're not healthy, you're insecure. We can turn that around and say, what do you want to do? How do you want to get better? You can do it. What are the things that you can do to improve your performance? What are the skills that you need? What are the kind of steps that you can take, those action steps you can take? And so turning that around. Like I said, self-control, procrastination, and attention, these are sort of the big barriers for all of us, right? So we all suffer from these kinds of things. You may have suffered from this at one point in the past, the choice at lunch between a salad and a hamburger. I know, I have nutrition knowledge. I know the salad's healthier. Do I choose the salad? No, I choose the burger, right? I choose the fries. I choose the unhealthy thing, even though I know it's less good for me. I like the fries. I like the meat. So we all face this. If you take it out of the money context, you can think of lots of cases where you suffer from this. Exercise. I really did mean to exercise this morning. I didn't. Why? I don't know. I just had other things that came up. I didn't get it done. So, we all have this. Or the procrastination, right? So I knew this talk was going to happen tonight many, many weeks ago, but I got it in, 24 hours ago, right? So this is the way time works. We tend to procrastinate and wait till the last minute on things. So we oftentimes talk about these sort of coaching models of thinking about performance improvement. You can do what you need to do to improve your finances. Let's help you set some goals and move forward on that. And so the coach doesn't tell you what to do. The coach doesn't wave their finger at you and make you feel bad for what you did or didn't do. The coach really helps you figure out what steps you need to take are and then hold you accountable to it. Whatever you said you were going to do, we'll hold you accountable to doing that. So we, on campus, we teach a financial coaching class, and then we have done, I don't know, since 2010, probably 2 or 3 dozen trainings for practitioners around financial coaching, where we've trained probably 200 or 300 people. And we oftentimes use this model of the 4 A's, 4 A's of coaching. So the alliance, which is between the coach and the coachee or the client, that we're going to work together. We're partners. We're at level, and I'm going to help you, and you're going to help me, and we're going to move together towards whatever goals you want. The agenda are your goals. The agenda is set by the client, whatever they want to do. The actions are the action steps that they want to go forward with. And then the awareness is being aware of the things that hold you back, whether it's procrastination, friends and family, spouses, other kinds of things that might hold you back, and try to move forward. So what do we see from this financial coaching model? It's a relatively new model. We've really seen it in the field over the last 3-4 years at larger numbers. We've probably got about 10,000 people who've gone through one large federally funded financial coaching now. We're definitely seeing people setting goals, reaching goals, feeling more confident. And then when we do things like look at their credit reports, they're more likely to pay their bills on time. We see examples of people setting aside money, paying more than the minimum on their credit cards and those kinds of things. So we're starting to see some real behavior associated with these programs. All right, the last leg to talk about is financial inclusion. Financial inclusion is an interesting concept because it really didn't emanate from the U.S. Financial inclusion is something you hear a lot more in developing countries where that you may have seen, like the M-Pesa in Africa. It's a mobile phone that people are doing, because there aren't banks in a lot of pretty rural places or even in some cities. So they use, mobile phones to be able to do transactions. And so, M-Pesa has been this real financial inclusion tool in Africa. We haven't heard the term financial inclusion as much in the U.S., but if you look at the data in the U.S., there's about 10% of people in the U.S. who have no bank account, no attachment with any financial institution whatsoever, and about 1/4 of people in the U.S., of households in the U.S., who have sort of intermittent connections with financial institutions. They might have an account for a little bit, they may have an account and then it goes negative and then it gets closed down and then actually they're not allowed to get an account again. Or they might use sort of what we call alternative financial institutions. So they're cashing checks at gas stations, check cashing stores, and using sort of alternative financial services. So we actually have a financial inclusion agenda here as well. This isn't just an international issue. And then if you talk about things like access to credit, about 1/3 of people say they can't get credit. They can't get the kind of credit that they want to get, whether it's a mortgage, car loan, a credit card loan, those kinds of things. So, we may take it for granted because we see credit advertised all the time that everybody can get credit. There's a lot of people who still struggle. We think about this mostly financial inclusion as sort of financial products, but it's also services. It's advice and other kinds of activities that people might want to have. The other one that I talked about, credit and savings and college savings and retirement savings are another ones. But insurance is another one that we oftentimes don't think a lot about. I think there's some great examples of how insurance can really become a valuable product because it allows people to risk pool in different ways. If you're not in the insurance market and something bad happens to you, you do share that risk with other people, right? So if somebody in your family has something bad happen to them and they don't have insurance, they probably come to you or to your social network for help, which is fine. Maybe you have a social network that has a nice risk pool and can handle that. But you can imagine there's some people who everybody in their pool looks like them, and nobody has a lot of resources, and everybody has lots of risks all the time, and so that's not a great risk pool. So we can think about insurance as another way to do these kinds of things. The book that you heard earlier, this Fragile Balance book, this is a book we did with the Mott Foundation to try to understand this idea of emergency savings, which is a really unusual type of savings, and that there is no such thing, well, at least when we wrote the book, 2013, there really wasn't any such thing as an emergency savings account. In fact, if you went to a bank and said, I want to open up an account with $100 in it, they'd probably say, thank you, no thank you. A $100 account costs us too much to maintain. We'd rather you take your money elsewhere. And so, many people who have small accounts end up paying so much in fees. If you have a $100 account that's below the minimum balance and you pay a $9.95 a month fee, by the end of the year, there's nothing left in your account. In fact, you might actually owe money. So, there aren't a lot of great account features. So in this book, we had about a dozen different practitioners from across the country describe models that they were experimenting with, embedded into health system, embedded into housing, embedded in, different ways that people could start to build up some kind of a savings for themselves. So why do we think this emergency savings issue is such a big deal? One is that income is a lot more volatile than it used to be. By volatile, I mean ups and downs, right? So we just see more and more of that. Employers are now scheduling people differently. It's not always 40 hours. Sometimes it's 33, sometimes it's 28, sometimes it's 37, whatever. Also payment timing is much more regular. There was a day when you could put your check in an envelope and stick it in the mailbox and you get the float. The float was the time it took that letter with the check in it to get to whoever you were paying. Now I pay on my phone, and it deposits. I don't know if I owed taxes this year. The IRS cashed my check that I filed electronically online in about 35 minutes, right? So there was no float at all in the system whatsoever. So payment timing is becoming much more granular. People know exactly when their paycheck hits, and they know exactly when their bills get paid, because everything is much tighter in its timing. The other thing is that as we get more income volatility, we're also getting more expense shocks. So let's say you have health insurance, but your health insurance has a high deductible, or your health insurance has a copay. And so suddenly you have to pay for that, or you have to pay for that for one of your kids, or you have to do a car repair, or you have to do a house repair. Those spikes and dips in your expenses, which are hard to predict, with your income spikes and dips. Imagine a month when the expense spikes and the income dips. Even though you're relatively financially stable, now you've got this big gap, and unless you had some cushion, you're really in trouble. So about a third of households in 2004 showed some swings, and some big swings in their income, and about half had an unexpected expense. So this happens a lot to a lot of people. This emergency savings thing isn't just a low income issue. So here's the issue of the income volatility and the growth of income volatility here by education level. So you can see the no high school group. So these tend to be the lowest wage workers who are more hourly, and we see a lot more of the scheduling issues, especially for that group. Here's some data from, I'll highlight this book in a minute, but this US Financial Diaries project where they actually tracked people for 15 months, every single expense and everything that came in and out of their household. Really detailed data for about 300 households. So on average, a family that they studied had about 2.6 spikes and about 2.5 dips in their income over, I think this was over the 15-month period, and pretty big, by a quarter or more of what their typical spending or income would be. So here's an example of one family they looked at where they had sort of a base income. The husband had a job in a body shop, but even that dipped, especially around December, January. And then they had a rental unit that sometimes went vacant, and so they didn't get any rental income. They had some food assistance from food stamps, but that wasn't all the time. So we see lots of variation in their budget. So the Financial Diaries is this book. It just came out last week. And it's available in a lot of bookstores. It's basically tells the stories of these families that were in this study. So Jonathan Murdoch and Rachel Schneider, who have been frequent visitors here on campus actually for various events that we've done over the last few years. This is an unsolicited plug for their book, but I think it really does tell the story really well about these families. All right, so why do we care so much about these spikes and dips? Well, it disrupts consumption. You were spending money on something regularly, something maybe that was valuable and productive, and now you can't. So by valuable and productive, that might be nutritious food, or it might be rent, or it might be something that was furthering your education, something like that. And it's really hard to think ahead for the future if you're constantly scrambling to make ends meet today. And so that's what we see is when people see these spikes and dips, their time span gets shorter, and their goals for the future get to be much shorter. It's not about what do I want to do 10 years from now. It's about how do I get through the month? How do I get through the week? And so it starts to really truncate how far they can think. Sometimes it results in a credit spiral. The way I can make ends meet is by borrowing, but then next month when that bill's due, I have to pay that bill, so I have to borrow to pay that bill, and then I get caught in this spiral. And then there's these mental health and physical effects, and this is something I've been trying to think more about. How do we see that manifest itself that constant stress and struggle manifested in kids and parents and adults, and how they do over time. All right, so I've sort of already given away what I think the answer is. But so what action do you think improves people's, not necessarily yours, but people's subjective well-being the most? A, budgeting. B, having an emergency fund. C, setting financial goals. D, seeking financial counseling. Or E, something else. So how many people say A, budgeting? How many people say B, having an emergency fund? C, setting financial goals. D, financial counseling. And E, something else. Yeah, so it's, there's a lot of different aspects to this. And the truth is that budgeting for a long time was kind of, I do a lot of work with Extension. A lot of people on Extension, that was what they did. We help people make budgets. The problem is that if you've ever made a budget, I actually met earlier today with an economist who's pretty well known and studies lots of issues around personal finance and household finance. Basically said he did a budget 5 years ago, he hasn't looked at it since, right? And I think that's the case for a lot of us. We did it once, that felt good, now we're going to move on. So budgeting is kind of hard. Setting financial goals, I would argue, is very important and really what drives people's help, drives people to move forward. Seeking financial counseling when you're in a pinch is critical. We saw this in the housing crisis. We spent almost $1 billion in this country on housing counseling when people were facing problems paying their mortgages. It really did help people. The problem is those same people 3 months later might come back for the next issue, and then 3 months later their next issue, and it's sort of like putting food out for the cat, right? So you sort of never get people to move on and be more independent on their own. So all your answers were good answers. I would personally say B, that having an emergency fund is really important. So here's some data from JP Morgan Chase Institute. So JP Morgan, as you know, is a bank. They have tens of millions of customers around the world, but they have about 3 million customers who actually have everything with JP Morgan: their credit card, their mortgage, their checking account, their savings, everything. And so this is an example of big data. For those of you who've been to these talks before, you've probably heard about big data before. So they're able to use this big data and to actually look at people's real account balances and to see what's the case. When do people really get pinched? And what they find is that what people need is about a $4,800 cushion, and what they really have is about a $3,000 cushion, and so they have about $1,800 shortfall. Now, let me remind you, these are J.P. Morgan Chase customers, right? These are pretty affluent people. I mean, these are J.P. Morgan Chase customers are not your low-wage workers. These are people who have probably pretty steady jobs, and even here we see a shortfall of about $1,800. So I think this is pretty powerful data that they put together. And from their own data, they can show that about half of households have about a 30% change in income from month to month. So big income fluctuations. So, you'll sometimes hear financial planners say you need to have 3 months saved, 3 months of your income saved. That's really hard to do. And sometimes when we tell that to audiences, they sort of say, "Oh, forget it. I can't come with three months, so I'll just do nothing." And so, I tend to think of it this way: like, what's in a payment that you really want to make sure you can make? That if you would sleep better tonight if you knew you could make that payment. And a lot of people would say their rent or their mortgage. That's a payment I've got. So, okay, that's a great goal. Your goal should be to save up 1 month's rent or mortgage. And once you get that, go for 2, right? And think about how much better you'd sleep at night if you had 2 months rent or mortgage put away. So some people it might just be a car repair. That might be the thing that keeps them awake at night. Those kinds of things that might impact them. But we also want to think about emergency savings as not just for a negative thing. Maybe you get an opportunity. You get to go on a training that helps you get a better, get a promotion at work, or you get an opportunity to do something that would really enhance your quality of life. We really want to think about these emergency funds as really contingency funds, both positive and negative. Some of the things we see, in the employment market are really pretty amazing. And the New York Times and some others have done a lot of coverage on this. But the ability to schedule people for fractions of hours and to have you show up at work and then send you right home, or we basically have software now that can predict when we need you and when you're going to be productive and when we don't need you, which is great unless you're the worker who's subject to a computer who's coming up with a formula about when you should be there. And so that really makes it hard for people it really sort of undermines people's financial well-being. But then when we think about, well, how would you bridge these gaps? what kinds of products would you use? Like I said before, there really aren't savings products that let you have low balances, so that's hard. Credit, yeah, maybe, but we do see people use credit cards when they run into trouble, but not everybody can get a credit card, and then when you do, you have to pay it back, and if you don't pay it back, then you start to get in that sort of debt spiral. And then insurance, you could think about insurance. A lot of these are insurable risks, like a car breakdown is kind of an insurable risk. A job loss is actually an insurable risk. We can think about these kinds of things, but those products just don't exist. So there's a lot of market failures, a lot of places where the market could do more, and we really haven't seen that kind of improvement. We do see people, we just finished tax time, right? So we do see people absolutely use their tax return, their tax refund as a form of savings. They get their tax refund and they spend money on stuff they ordinarily wouldn't spend on. I have a student right now who's looking at people buying in bulk. When they get their tax refund, they get a chunk of extra money, and what do? They go out and buy, where they used to buy, say, the 6-pack of toilet paper, they buy the 24-pack of toilet paper, right? So we buy it lower per unit, and I'm able to sort of smooth my consumption over time. We also see people who borrow and save simultaneously. So they borrow for making ends meet, but they also have a cushion to pay those things that they can't borrow for. I can't give my landlord a credit card, so I have some cash in a savings account that I can make up for the rent, but other things I can use a credit card for. So we see people sort of trading off these different kinds of forms of liquidity over time. The Federal Reserve did a study last year where they really highlighted this issue of credit is kind of the key. If people are struggling to pay their bills and they can't get credit, they're really kind of pinched. And it's almost an equalizer across these different income groups. If they're not confident they can get credit, then it makes it much harder for them to be able to come up with the money they need to pay their bills. So access to credit really is an important part of this. So anyway, I think our main takeaway from a lot of this work is that volatility is really hard for people to manage. And I can teach you about volatility, I can show you it exists, but learning how to manage that is hard, and especially if it's an increasing volatility for you. That stress, that planning, it's all kinds of hard to do, hard tasks to be able to handle. And so really it comes down to liquidity. How do you get liquidity? How do you manage it? And we don't spend a lot of time thinking about this. We think the safety net is, if the unemployment programs that we have are, you have to have been in a job that's covered by unemployment insurance. There's some time before you can file for unemployment insurance. There's a lot of rules and regulations around it. By the time that kicks in for a lot of families, they're already way behind. We don't have shorter term. We don't have any kind of insurance against just a cutback in hours. We don't have any kind of those kinds of safety nets that are available. And in fact, in a lot of programs, you have to really be, close to broke, no assets, and very little income or no earned income to be able to get into the safety net at all. So, people who are sort of struggling really have to drop lower before they can get the kind of support. There was a proposal a couple of years ago to have an emergency fund to prevent people from getting into social programs, but never really moved forward. So, this is a policy issue I think that really we could see some action around. I think the idea of encouraging emergency and contingency savings is really important to be able to get people to set aside a little bit of money, that cushion, that resilience that they need for financial well-being. Also, I think we could see a lot more credit and insurance innovations, ways to insure against small events that really set people off. Microinsurance. We see this a lot in the developing countries, beginning to see it a little bit here. And then we have some really cool ideas from Fintech, the financial technology area. There's apps like Even, which will take your high months of wages and your low months of wages and help you even them out, right? So they'll actually sort of store them up and then give you a sort of steady paycheck. And then we have FinTech. So FinTech is sort of, more traditional technologies, maybe not on high-tech things like your mobile phone, but still help you to plan and to sort of manage things over time. And I think, policy-wise, the idea of encouraging emergency savings, we offer tax incentives for retirement savings. We offer tax incentives for college savings. We offer lots of tax incentives for borrowing, like mortgages. We offer no incentives for people to have a cushion and emergency fund. In fact, we make it hard to do it through a lot of the way that the systems are set up. So here's an example from San Francisco, a nonprofit organization called EARN that started this online savings platform for emergency savings. It's San Francisco, so of course it's technology enabled, but the idea of a lot of low-income people have cell phones, but they don't have bank accounts. So we're going to create a way for them to save for an emergency on a cell phone platform. So it's a great sort of new model they've been thinking about. And just locally, there's a company called Safety Net. That's a private insurance company that is insuring people against a job loss. And you know, for $20 a month, you can get $6,000 worth of coverage. If you can prove that you lost your job, then they'll pay you the $6,000, and you can use that until maybe you qualify for unemployment insurance or you can get another job. So great example. They're actually expanding this to do expenses too, like a car repair, refrigerator repair, those kinds of things. So they've been doing more ads on the radio lately, so you may have heard of them. But it's a cool idea, and I wish them luck as they move forward. So just a few. I'll wrap up here. Just a few resources to share with you. So this, and I know you can't take these from the slides, but these slides are available publicly, and so a lot of the things I've talked about today are on the internet. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has a financial well-being scale and website. You can look more about that. We have a financial coaching website with extension that you can look for, and then there's the Center for Financial Security website. All of these, if you just Google the terms, the websites will come up, so you don't have to necessarily memorize these. And then these slides are actually on my website at UW as well. So I'll stop there, and I'm open to questions. We do have microphones. As you heard earlier, we need to, even though I can hear you fine, the camera won't hear you, so we just need to make sure that people can use those microphones.
My question is about artificial intelligence as well as robotics. And do you see a future where people will just get a stipend for pay?
Yeah, there's been more and more talk about this. So this idea of a universal basic income, and what does that mean for how labor is treated in this country? And you know, so I'll put aside the robotics issue for just a minute and just talk this idea generally first about, you know, what would it mean if we actually let people have a base level of income? If, you know, I talked about those volatility of those dips and spikes. What if we said, yeah, you can have spikes and dips, but there's a floor, and you know, we'll always make sure you have, you know, I think some of the proposals I've seen they're mostly aimed at families with kids. If you have one child, your income will never dip below $500 a month, which seems pretty basic. And then, you know, if you have a higher income, we'll just tax that back anyway. But I think it's a really interesting concept because it would take away the risk of really things falling apart, and maybe it would encouraging people to be more, to take more risks, or to not have to worry as much about some of these kinds of things. And I think the part of it, the robotics and the other kinds of pieces of this, is what happens when the labor market, when basically this is sort of the you know, we all become cogs, right? That most of the function of labor become replaced by capital, and you know, maybe there's some basic role for the basic income in that. That's, you know, a little more futuristic, but I'm really just thinking about the volatility itself, and could we prevent some kind of floor on that volatility? I think the other aspect of we might begin to see is more software that can actually help you predict when you might need a cushion, right? So it wouldn't be hard with big data, especially the kind of data that JP Morgan Chase has, to say, you know what, people like you tend to have a drop in income next month, right? People like you are due for an expense, and that expense could be happen soon, and the average expense is around $3,000, and you should be prepared. So we might see some ways that there's artificial intelligence actually helps people be more financially savvy at the same time. So that's sort of a long-winded answer to around your question, but I appreciate that.
You talked some about high school age financial literacy. What perspectives would you have for younger children? So we have young children and thinking about how do we begin their education?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have younger kids myself. One of the things that it was in Milton, Wisconsin yesterday, talking with the high school program there, does financial education. And one of the things that they had a high school junior, she was talking about her experience with financial education in high school. She said, so many of my friends' parents won't talk to them about finances. They're afraid to talk about money. And everyone kind of nodded there. I see people here doing that too. It's a taboo. So parents are afraid to reveal to their kids how much money they make. how much debt they have, how much their mortgages are, how much taxes they pay. Parents are, it's just an uncomfortable topic. It's uncomfortable for any of us to talk about these kinds of things among friends even, but our kids, like why not share your tax return with your child? Why not let them know, look at your pay stub and understand what the different forms of FICA taxes are that are out there. So I don't know, not everybody would do that. But I think the point is really breaking down those taboos is really important, and to make kids feel comfortable with money, and to make it not feel like a taboo subject. And we did an experiment once with Child Protective Services workers who, go into people's homes and ask them things about, have you used intravenous drugs? Have you been a victim of sexual violence? All these things that most makes us, sort of uncomfortable. And we tried to get them to talk to their clients about money issues, and they're like, no, that's too personal. We can't talk about those kinds of things. And it's just, I think it's just an example of how uncomfortable we are as a society about these money things. So, one of the examples of activities with kids that I've seen are just reading books about money. So there's a Money as You Grow program. Actually, this week is Money Smart Week, right? Or next week too, where we start to, as a state, think about money issues. And so one of those things is the Big Read, where libraries across Wisconsin are going to be reading this Little Critter book, which about Little Critter saves to buy up a robot or something like that. But just the activity of reading a book with your kid about money can be an important issue. The other thing that we've begun to look more and more at is allowance. What does it mean to give your kid an allowance? $2 a week for an it's a payment for an activity. It's not a stipend. It's you had to earn it somehow. And the tasks may vary from younger kids just picking up after themselves to older kids actually doing something productive. And giving them the ability to sometimes blow the money, on something stupid, and then you say, well, what'd you learn from that? Let them make some mistakes in some small ways, and to build that up over time. When we look at the data, the families most likely to talk to their kids about money and to offer allowances are actually lower income families. So among higher income, more affluent families, they tend to push these issues even more to the side, which I feel like we see sometimes on campus. The kid who grew up in a household where they never talked about money with their parents, they never had a budget, they never had a bank account, they got to campus and they'd run out of money by November, right? Because they just never got those training wheels. So I think that scaffolding, that laddering, whatever you want to call it, of learning about financial behaviors is important.
I first became aware of microloans in a third world context. There's a lot of that going on.
Yep.
And only recently I've been seeing more and more microloan programs domestically. But I'm beginning to wonder, is there something like a personal microloan broker where I would like to loan, $500 to person B that I sort of know but not really. And it's kind of a risk for me to do that, and then I'd have to pay attention to it and monitor it. There's like a whole bunch of issues that I don't really even understand. Is there such a thing as a personal microloan broker that would bridge that gap?
Sort of. So there are particularly websites like Prosper and others where sort of pools of borrowers and lenders come together. They tend to be more around, so you sort of put yourself up as a borrower, you need a loan for a specific thing. I'm a contractor, I need to buy tools or, something like that. So you see a lot more of that. We also see models that are more what you described, sort of a pool of individuals who are maybe, they have some affinity with an organization or they're from some community, and they come together and they sort of do a pooled loan. And all those can work. I think that the trouble with a lot of these is just, in economics we think about this idea of information asymmetry, which is you don't really know if that guy who says he's borrowing money to buy his tools is really going to borrow money to buy tools. And, so I think, and then how do you go after him? And how do you do collections? And how do you deal with if you had to go to court and try to get a payment? So all those issues become really, really pertinent. And that's really been the struggle in the U.S. In developing countries, it's simpler because there's just less stuff, like less regulatory and other kinds of burdens that have to be dealt with. So I do think we are seeing some of those models, but it definitely has been a struggle for some of those programs to get going, especially to serve underserved populations. as opposed to businesses and more affluent populations.
I already have a microphone, so
okay,
I'm going
good,
to
yeah.
ask a question. My question is kind of about the life as a service, kind of the rent versus buy, and whether there's kind of new rules of thumb as we introduce things like Uber and whether you should go out to eat or cook at home, kind of things like that, and just are there rules of thumb on life as a service?
Yeah, and so this question really gets at we've seen an increasing shift of I buy a house and I buy a car and I buy all this stuff, but I don't really use it all the time. That's sort of inefficient use of assets. Why don't we share those things so that we can make these things more affordable for all? I think so. A lot of this is technology driven. I mean, it would be really hard to have Uber without mobile phones, and so we're going to see more and more of these applications grow over time. I still think there's something about owning that has a sort of psychological kind of significance. So, there's a lot of work around home ownership, and home ownership is kind of irrational. Why would I want to own this land that I have to maintain? I'm not a farmer. I don't really want to have to maintain real estate. I don't want to have to, to deal with this property, but I really want to own a home. I don't know why. We have this sort of cultural significance to owning things. And so I think there's still some of that. I could see it happening with transportation much more quickly than I could with housing, where people start to really just say, I don't really particularly have any pride of ownership of a car. I just want to get from place to place, and I can just, sort of buy that service, and I don't have to own it anymore. I think the struggle with a lot of these service-based models is that, take for example, housing. That is the largest asset that most households have. It is the main way they save, the forced savings to the mortgage. And so, what would they do? Would they put their money then into a retirement account or some other kind? That would be great. I mean, if they actually just switched from one asset to another kind of asset, that would be great. More likely, they're just going to consume all of it on other stuff. And so, do we then result in a model where people are buying services their whole life until they basically run out of income, and then what do they do? And then, how do we think about that kind of model? So it is interesting. It's definitely new. And we'll see if people start to not own cars and buy services, whether that happens in other kinds of markets as well. We've certainly seen dramatic changes in society. Think about 2 generations ago, how self-sufficient they were in terms of food production versus today, where we buy basically ready-to-cook meals. I mean, it's a really different kind of environment. So we might start to see more of a shift there too. But what really is a question of how that affects the rest of consumption and savings, and that's sort of an unknown. Over here.
Hi. At our kids' school, they used to have lunch tickets, and it was easy to say, hey, you have 5 tickets a month, you can buy hot lunch once a week, and they'd have that. Now things have moved more to, they have a card, and, there's much more virtual things. They have less learning of actually what that means, and maybe think, I can scan this every day to get stuff. And I think of that as how do you teach kids about the credit and the virtual aspects of money? And then even probably that seems to probably have bad effects potentially in younger adults and even others. Yeah. If you can maybe speak to that.
Yeah, I was last year. I was at a conference in Europe, and somebody from one of the Scandinavian countries, I think it was Sweden, was saying that their kids, they don't have change. So their kids have a piggy bank, but it's just a digital piggy bank. So they just make digital deposits in the kids' piggy bank because they don't have change. Because one of the things I was saying, it's great to have a jar that you could put change into. And they're like, well, we have jars, but we don't have change. So I think it gets to this point of how do we think about, as we go to sort of cashless society, which we're not in there by any means, but certainly we're a lot more than we were 10 years ago. How do we deal with some of these issues? People spend more when they don't have the bills, right? So it does change the way we think about things. Kids like tangible things. When we do activities now, a lot of times the kids will use buttons in lieu of coins because we still want them to have some tangible thing, even though maybe we don't use coins as much. So I do think that's an important part of this. But I also think we have to be realistic. Today's generation of kids grew up literally with a tablet or a phone in their hands, and so they may adapt to this much more quickly than the rest of us. The idea for them of virtual currency or virtual change may not be such a big deal. It may be a bigger deal to us than to them, and so we may see a more seamless reaction to that. I mean, even the 18-year-olds on this campus, when they open up bank accounts locally, the vast majority don't get. In fact, they don't even get offered a checkbook or a checking account. They just don't use it. They want a debit card. They wouldn't know how to write a check. And if you got a check out, they'd look at you like you had two heads. It just isn't something that they use. And so, there's already been a shift in things like that. And frankly, we're one of the last countries in the world that still use checks. Most of the rest of the world has really moved away from those kinds of things. So anyway, I think there is a lot of change in technology, and I think we're going to start to see more changes in the way that our young people adapt as well.
Yeah, I have a question. This gentleman's question a couple of questions ago made me think of this. Do you ever talk or think about helping families bridge their own and extended families, or friends and families extend their liquidity issues? Because I can think of this in a lot of circumstances where I've seen somebody who needed $3,500 to fix their car, to buy a car, and they can't get the loan from anywhere. But their brother's got plenty of money, could be lending to them. But there's a taboo within the family about lending money, or the brother would be happy to lend the money, but he would feel uncomfortable asking for the money back. And so it's really kind of a intra-family market failure, where the loan money is available and the need is there, but because of these taboos around money, people don't solve the equation. And I think a lot of cases it's just a question of, well, no, go in and ask for the money and write a contract and say, I'm going to pay you back, and say, I expect to be paid back, and let's have some interest. And if you put it on a business basis, a lot of times everybody feels more comfortable with it, and you can get over those problems and find the money that's available right in front of you.
Right. Yeah, when we do surveys, the number one source of resources that people say they'll use when they run into trouble is friends and family. But it's often informal, and I think that's the rub. So it doesn't get formalized like you suggest, and part of that's probably a financial literacy issue. Part of that is the sort of transaction costs maybe that people foresee in that. And we had, when we did interviews around this financial well-being concept, a lot of people made the point that loans from friends and family are not free. There's a high psychic cost, right, of whether it's of that'll constantly be reminding me that we did this thing and that I owe them, and there's that part of it. But there's also this sense of once my extended friends and family know that I have some resources, and then they're going to start asking me. And so there's this reciprocity issue that they're worried about. Once I borrow, and then they borrow from me, and then everybody's going to come after me, and sort of this, this kind of issue there. So I do think, though, it's probably from a financial planning or study of household finance, we really underestimate how important those social and familiar networks are, and we don't do a good job of sort of recognizing it, formalizing it, helping people think about it. It is a bit of a taboo, even among people who think about these kinds of things regularly. And oftentimes surveys don't even ask questions about it. So it's something we just sort of pretend doesn't exist. And so it is a really important point, and I think an area where, probably an area where we're going to see more work in the future.